In this tech-focused video, we're going to examine the PC version of Dragon Age Veilguard. While a feature-rich PC game and fairly well performing, it is another new release that adds on to the growing trend of CPU-heavy games. We're going to look at quite a few things: impact of ray tracing, upscaling, frame generation, and different ways to optimize the performance. So let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. We're going to begin our run in the Elven Forest, and I've chosen this location because it is one of the more demanding areas in the game that will make for an interesting benchmark. While we're using some pretty high-end hardware, RTX 4090 with a Ryzen 7800X3D, the way these settings impact the overall performance is knowledge that can be used across a multitude of other hardware. Let's start with the settings. I play on a 3440 by 1440 QD-OLED ultrawide display, so that'll be the targeted resolution here. We're going to start without any upscaling. Instead, we're using DLAA for anti-aliasing. If we jump over to the graphics tab, I've manually set everything to ultra, maxed everything out, including the ray tracing. Reflections, ambient occlusion, and ultra ray tracing is set to on. By the way, there is a selective option you can set for ray tracing that doesn't actually turn the ray tracing on, but we're going to dive a bit deeper into the ray tracing in a little bit. But other than that, everything else is maxed out. And with that, we have as good looking of a game as we can possibly get, at least from a technical standpoint. Personally, I think the graphics actually look really nice in this game, and we're getting between 60 to 70 FPS. That's not too bad. Now, I understand some people prefer more realistic graphics, especially those that have played other Dragon Age games. Personally, I don't have any nostalgia for it because I never really played it. What drew me to this game primarily, though, was mostly the combat. It looked interesting. I've actually been enjoying playing my mage, and I've gone with a specialization that's more like parry focused and somewhat of like a melee up close focus. It's actually a lot of fun, guys, but that's besides the point and not really the focus of this video. But just a quick side note, even though I never played the Dragon Age game, somehow I missed it. I love older BioWare games and I am an RPG fan. So in preparation for the Veilguard release, I began playing Dragon Age Origins for the first time about 5 or 6 days ago and put in about 14 hours to check out the writing by the time Veilguard launched. So I might make a separate video talking about what I think of the game overall, not from a tech perspective. I don't make those type of videos, but if there's interest, I might do it. But if we switch back to the topic of this video, right? Getting around 70 FPS in this area with all the graphical settings maxed out at this resolution, which is between 1440p and 4K as far as pixel count goes, it's actually not too bad. But could we get more FPS if we wanted to? If we wanted to turn on DLSS? Well, the short answer and the right answer is no. If you look at the GPU utilization, right, we are CPU bound. Our GPU utilization is at around 80 to 90%. So yeah, guys, the reason why I chose this area is because it's actually a lot more CPU heavy than the other areas. I mean, look at that CPU utilization. It's quite high. This has been kind of a growing trend lately with new games being quite CPU heavy. And to be fair to this game, at least it doesn't have any stuttering issues, which is actually good. Sucks that we have to point it out, but I think we do. But this scenario presents a good opportunity to explain how CPU bottlenecks work as well. And while looking at the overall GPU utilization can tell you a lot, there's other things you can do to check. For example, let's turn on DLSS Quality, right? Normally, you would expect to see a higher frame rate, but that's not what happens. We're still getting 65 to 70 FPS, except for now GPU utilization has gone from 90% all the way to 65, 70%. Now, what's adding a lot to the CPU demand in this particular case is ray tracing. Ray trace reflections, to be more specific. So if we turn that from on to selective or off, it doesn't matter. It's still the same thing. Selective doesn't actually turn ray tracing on. We go from 65 to 70 FPS all the way to 115 FPS. And now we have a GPU that is not necessarily fully saturated, but it's quite close. It's at 95, 98%. So this is with DLSS Quality on top as well. And if we go ahead and turn off ray traced ambient occlusion as well, we gain a little bit more FPS, about 10 extra FPS. So now we're at 125 FPS. That is a pretty decent gain, guys. Not sure if ray tracing is necessarily worth it in this particular case, but there is ways to make it work and get a higher refresh rate visual experience. Another thing that adds more of a load to the CPU, unsurprisingly, is also strand hair. So this makes the beautiful looking hair in this game actually a lot less interactive. And now we go from 125 to 135. So we started with 65 with everything maxed out, and we arrived at 135 with ray tracing turned off and strand hair turned off. Let's go back and put everything back to the way it was. No upscaling, DLAA, and I've turned on the ray tracing, maxed out everything back, because let's say I want to play with all the visual treats. There is something we can do to gain more frame rate, even though we are CPU bound in this particular case, and that is to use DLSS frame generation. And in this particular case, it actually works really well. Let's check it out. We're back to 65 to 70 FPS. And that takes us near 120 FPS, guys. So that means that 60 of the frames are real, the other half of the frames are real, half are interpolated. But I think as long as you're getting 60 real frames, it actually feels pretty good. And it looks like it is 120 FPS. Now, unfortunately, I don't think there's FSR frame generation in the game. I've yet to check that with an AMD GPU, but I think it's only DLSS frame generation. But for what it's worth, it is a very good implementation of it, because we've seen frame generation doesn't work as it was advertised in some games, like Horizon Forbidden West and Zero Dawn. Both FSR and DLSS frame generation don't generate a lot of frames, but here, as you can see, you can nearly double your FPS with it. So that works pretty well. Now, if we circle back to the ray tracing discussion, right, we are more or less forced to have to use frame generation if we want to go beyond 60 and to 100 FPS, because ray tracing is adding a load to our CPU, and we're using one of the fastest CPUs. If we turn frame generation off and throw DLSS quality, for example, right, we're pretty much hovering around 70 FPS anyway. But how worth it is ray tracing? How big of a difference does it make? Well, let's take a quick look at ray tracing. Water bodies are where it's the most noticeable. So let's take a look. I've turned ray tracing off here. We're back to using DLAA native resolution, all settings maxed out. And like you can see, this area is a bit less demanding than the forest. That's why I chose it. But here we're getting 100 FPS. I'd still say the water still looks pretty good. But you wouldn't know it, how much better it can look until you turn ray tracing on. But before that, let's check out the selective setting, because I did a few tests and I couldn't really see a difference. It still looks the same and our performance is still the same. Ray tracing is not on here. Now let's go from selective to on, and you can clearly see that ray tracing came on and now the water looks a lot better. And we went from 99 FPS, 95 FPS to 75, 77 FPS. So yeah, guys, if you want ray tracing on, set it to on. I don't really know what selective does. Maybe it only shows up in particular cutscenes, maybe. But here they are, guys, side by side. As you can see, the left and the middle are the same. Selective doesn't do anything. But I also wanted to take a look at a cutscene area. And here as well, ray tracing off and selective reflections look identical. The only reason why the middle RT selective is a bit more demanding than ray tracing off is because for this one I turned on ray trace ambient occlusion as well. But as far as visuals, yeah, it's pretty much the same. They look identical. Because I've seen some people say that they're getting all this FPS with ray tracing enabled, and they probably have it set to selective, because I know the cost to turning ray tracing on in this game. It's not necessarily massive, but it is a bit high, especially on the CPU too. Alright, so let's go back to what we were doing and take a look at a different area that is not as CPU demanding actually. And here we are using DLSS quality and all the other settings maxed out, including the ray tracing. Now this area here is about more in line of what you would normally see in the game, at least from what I've seen. So here with DLSS set to quality, we're not stuck at 60 or 70 FPS. Actually, we're above 100 FPS, or right around there, 100, 110 FPS. And it actually looks really good, DLSS. And the combat, actually, guys, it's a lot of fun. I have to be honest here. The way I've specialized my mage, like I mentioned in the beginning, is more of like a parry. The skill tree here is massive. Like, for the mage, you can specialize them however you want. I mean, the only thing I wish that the game had is if you could program all the abilities kind of like it is in World of Warcraft, or from what I've seen in Dragon Age Origins, since I checked that out the other day, you can put everything onto your action bar, 1 through 9, 1 through 10. I think that would be a bit better because I use an MMORPG mouse personally, so I have all the numbers on my thumb. But the game's clearly been designed around a controller, and it's kind of what I've been using, at least when I made this video. But to get back to the purpose of this video, most areas in the game are not going to be as CPU heavy as that 4 is, but the fact remains that right now we're not fully saturating our GPU either. So the only other option we have to increase our FPS is to use DLSS frame generation on top of DLSS quality. So let's take a quick look at that, and then we'll examine the type of performance we can get turning ray tracing off completely, because that is a pretty good way to play the game. I feel most will play it that way, and that's fine. And here we go, guys. We've enabled DLSS frame generation and DLSS quality. All the other settings are maxed out, and we went from around 110 FPS to 150. That's a pretty good jump. But again, right, if you think about it, half of the frames are interpolated. And we were already getting around 110 FPS, 90 to 110 with DLSS quality anyway. I think for the sake of responsiveness, I would personally probably just stick to DLSS quality and not bother with frame generation. I think frame generation makes more sense when you're heavily CPU bound, and that's how it was advertised to be anyway. Now here's where the game introduces the stagger mechanic, and this adds on to my enjoyment of the game too, because now the enemies have a stagger bar, and like I said, since I built my mage around the parry mechanic, I've been trying to get used to that. If you block right in time, most of you know what a parry is. It opens up a special attack, which was what I just did there. So I have to say, I like playing mages, but this is a more modern take, a more action-focused take to playing a mage, and I'm loving it. I love it. I think if you were to make a game like this, but put Dragon Origins Story, I really like Dragon Origins Story so far. 14 hours in, the writing, the voice acting, it's just so good. Feels like I'm in an epic, like Lord of the Rings type of fantasy world. I felt Dragon Age Origins grabbed me with its story and characters a lot more than this game has so far. Now, one thing I don't like particularly about this game's writing, even though I haven't played it for that long, is that it's got that Marvel, you know, where people make jokes all the time and they don't take things seriously. I don't like that. It's been way too played out in games. I think it just detracts from the immersion, at least for me. But the skills, look at the skills, the mage guys. This is just like a fraction of the direction you can take it. There's other directions that you can go. So yeah, I mean, they've done a really good job, I feel, with the combat and the specializations. At least from what I've seen and what I've played, it's quite good. It's very satisfying in that regard. So there is good in this game. The writing has been okay, but I haven't seen enough. Alright, so before we disable ray tracing, we're getting 76 FPS now. I've gone back and re-enabled DLAA. I turned off DLSS, turned off frame generation, and this is the type of frame rate we get. So let's go ahead and turn ray tracing off completely and see the type of improvements we get. Alright, so we're up to close to 110, guys. We went from 75 to 110 by turning ray tracing off. And guess what? This game still looks really nice. Again, the reflections are most noticeable around bodies of water or puddles, which are pretty frequent in this game. But I still think the game looks almost just as good, right? It still looks pretty good with ray tracing off. And for those that are purists that don't want any upscaling, don't want any frame generation, this is one way to go. Absolutely.
And there's probably another one.
Before we try to dial things any further, basically the type of frame rate we're getting here is similar to what we were getting with ray tracing maxed out and DLSS quality, but now we're doing this natively without DLSS or ray tracing. So again, the choice is yours. You should see similar type of performance gains on weaker GPUs as well. Of course, the frame rate's going to be different and maybe the resolution, but the hit to performance should be fairly similar, except for different brands of GPU and maybe generations, but you get the point. Now, other ways of getting extra performance is you could mess with the graphical settings. Like for example, here I went from the high graphical preset to the medium graphical preset, and I'm going from 120 to 140 FPS, but I felt the visuals took a little bit of a hit, and I haven't personally dived into all the settings to see which one is most demanding. I'm hoping Benchmark King will make a video because he does a really good job with that. Personally, I would just leave everything on Ultra except for the ray tracing if you need the extra performance, of course, and just use upscaling. I think it actually works really well. As a matter of fact, if we take a look at FSR quality here, it actually does a decent job with the anti-aliasing as well. I think it looks fine. Can be maybe a bit grainy at times, but I don't think it looks bad at all. It looks pretty good, and you get a little bump into the frame rate. When it comes to performance gains, whether you use FSR quality or DLSS quality, obviously it's the same. It's going to be the same type of performance gains. But another thing we could try to do here, if you want to go maximum FPS, is you could try to throw frame generation on top. That's really the only way without diving too much into the graphical settings individually. And if we throw DLSS frame generation on top of DLSS quality, it actually takes us somewhat close to 200 FPS. So I guess to wrap up this video and give my conclusion, Dragon Age Veilguard, from a tech perspective, it's actually a solid PC port. It's pretty good. It is quite CPU heavy in areas, and enabling ray trace reflections especially does have a pretty big CPU cost. Now, I don't know if that can be improved. I'm not a developer. Overall, the game does not suffer from any stuttering or anything like that, and it is quite scalable, right? You have many options you can tweak and turn, and knobs you can adjust. Ray tracing, reflections, they look very nice, of course, but I don't think it detracts too much by turning it off completely if you had to. And then you have all kinds of upscaling you can use to tailor your experience to however you want. And from what I can see, DLSS and FSR upscaling look pretty good. I didn't look into XeSS or anything like that, but they work pretty well. Now, with the growing trend of CPU heavy games that we've been getting lately, it is quite concerning, especially for people with older CPUs, because a lot of people still just upgrade their GPU and hold on to their older CPU. And I see people in the comment sections and on Reddit that upgrade their GPUs. They go from 20 series RTX to 40 series, and they're like, well, I don't see any gain in performance. That's because they use older CPUs. So this is quite concerning. I do actually plan, I'm thinking about making a video that focuses on looking at some more recent games that have been quite CPU heavy, because it is a concern going forward. Now, I don't know if I have this theory that the games are becoming a bit more CPU heavy because devs are using the CPU more to prevent stuttering, maybe by moving assets around in a certain way. This is just like a theory of mine. I don't know if it's true or anything like that. And I personally would rather have a game that's a bit more CPU heavy than have stutters. Well, ideally, I'd want a game to be properly optimized if possible, give the developers the proper time and tools to make a good PC port that runs well, but it's not a whole lot that we can change in that regard. But anyway, that's my thoughts on it. What did you guys think about Dragon Age Veilguard? Are you going to be playing it, or are you saying, heck nah? But anyway, guys, please give the video a like if you liked it. Let me know what you think. If you have any suggestions, any questions, leave them down in the comment section below. The community is actually very helpful. I do like reading your guys' interactions and comments talking about this stuff, because it's stuff I'm passionate about as well. But anyway, I appreciate you guys watching, liking the video, and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.
What the?